The commission is reconvened. La commission reprend.
Commissioner, our last witness for today is Minister Alghabra, Minister of Transportation. Could I have the witness sworn, please?
Minister Alghabra, will you swear on a religious document or do you wish to affirm?
Affirm, please.
For the record, please state your full name and spell it out.
Omar Alghabra, O-M-A-R-A-L-G-H-A-B-R, E-B-R-A.
Do you solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given by you to this commission shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Minister Alghabra. I'm going to start with a bit of housekeeping, as we usually do with the witnesses. I'm going to ask you to remember that a couple of months ago we had an interview where we got some information from you that ended up getting put into a summary form and then sent to you and your staff for review. And what I'd like you to do is confirm that that you reviewed it, that you considered it to be generally accurate, and that you adopted as part of your testimony before the Commission today.
Yes and yes.
Thank you. And for the record, I don't need this clerk, but for the record, it's WTS 6075. As you know, Minister, we've already heard from your deputy, with whom I canvassed pretty much the same issues that we're going to talk about today, but our perspective, our point of interest today is your perspective as the minister. And so let me just begin. As I recollect our interview, you were appointed by the Minister of Transport in January 2021. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And can you give us just a brief account of your professional training and how you came into politics and ultimately to the position of Minister of Transport?
Okay. I'll take the 2 hours then.
No, the 1 or 2 minute version.
I'm a mechanical engineer by education with an MBA, Masters of Business Administration. I worked for many years in the private sector in the energy field, and I used to volunteer for politics, knocking on doors for candidates. And one day a vacancy came in my riding, and I decided to run for office. And I got elected for the first time in 2006. And then in 2008, the voters sent me back to the private sector. And then I was lucky enough to get re-elected in 2015. And between 2015 and 2021, I served as parliamentary secretary in different roles. And in January 2021, the Prime Minister asked me to be the Minister of Transport.
And if we can pick up the narrative here, so to speak, at the beginning of the development of the convoy and how it first came to your attention, and what your perspective was, what you saw coming, and what concerned you with respect to the mandate of your department.
Because of my role, I've been involved heavily in government policies when it came to vaccine mandates and keeping Canadians safe. So I was involved with my colleagues in developing those policies, and I was involved in the development of the decision to include a vaccine mandate for the transportation sector. We had an election on that, and we got re-elected as a government. And I was tasked by the Prime Minister to complete, it was part of my mandate letter, to ensure the protection of the safety of those who work in the industry and those who use the industry. There were eventually some opposition, and where it manifested in this form of convoy protest that I heard about. I was briefed about it by the department first, and then through law enforcement agencies.
And what issues what issues did the convoy present? I mean, obviously it's a convoy of trucks and you're the Minister of Transport, but can you tell me about the connection between the federal responsibility for transport and the provincial responsibility for transport, and how you decided your department could become involved helpfully in managing the protests and the convoy?
It was the protests at the beginning was against all mandates, and at that time there were vaccine mandates at all levels of government. In fact, there were vaccine mandates in the private sector as well. There were vaccine mandates in universities. So I felt that there wasn't clear who they're asking. I mean, there is a sense that they're asking the federal government, but the reality is that whatever they were protesting crossed or transcended all governments and private sector. So we, though, were still concerned about safety, about the outcome of because we heard different reports on what the objective of these protests. People linked it to potentially what happened in the U.S. in Washington D.C. On January 6th. So there was a lot of anxiety, and we certainly wanted to make sure that the federal government was prepared for this protest. So we were briefed by law enforcement agencies that. And again, Ottawa is not unaccustomed to protests. It is, after all, the capital of our nation, where there are typical protests. So we were briefed that law enforcement agencies were prepared. The hope that this was going to be like most protests, it might last a weekend, it might last a few days after the weekend, but the hope and the expectation that it wasn't going to go on for a very long time.
Right. And needless to say, it didn't last just the weekend. When did it become apparent that your department was going to be more heavily involved than just observing the events unfold, and that you would be asked by the government to take a role in finding solutions?
I would say a few days into the protest, where it had become clear that this was not a usual protest. There was a sense that there is some stalemate by law enforcement and other type of agencies. So what I decided to do, what our government decided to do, is to task our officials to figure out what tools that we have in the federal authority to deal with the occupation, because by that time it had become an occupation. So we tasked the official to do this. They did a lot of work looking. They couldn't find any legislation or regulation, because the jurisdiction was local law enforcement. It either was the responsibility of the local police or the provincial authorities. So then what we did, and what I tasked our department, is to put together a toolkit to be proactive, out of a sense of being proactive and collaborative and constructive, to put together a toolkit based on the rules and the regulations that the department has found to be utilized to help enforce the law and to help mitigate or manage the escalation of the situation. So that's where eventually the strategic enforcement strategy became to be.
And we heard from your deputy about the development of what I think was originally called the maximum enforcement strategy, ended up evolving into the strategic enforcement strategy, about seeing what laws from various jurisdictions could be brought to bear on the situation. And we don't need to rerun the evidence that he gave us, because he gave us quite a thorough account of it. But the point I remember him mentioning, and I'll ask you to comment on from the ministerial perspective, is that just the way the Department of Transport works, because it has to take its federal responsibility and coordinate that with all of the provinces and territories, there's already a very strong network within the Department of Transport with all of the partner agencies or equivalent agencies, including law enforcement and regulation in each of the provinces and territories. And would that level of connectivity and intergovernmental relations also apply at the ministerial level?
Indeed. I would say I have very constructive, positive relationship with my provincial counterparts. We meet at least once a year in Council of Ministers. Transportation is one of those areas that has a lot of shared responsibilities between the federal and provincial governments. So we either meet as a council or one-on-one. This is quite a common practice throughout my year and a half as a Minister of Transport.
And as at the ministerial level, did you, for the purposes of implementing, or I suppose I should say, originally developing and then hopefully getting the cooperation of the provinces and territories to implement the strategic enforcement strategy, were you reaching out to your ministerial colleagues at the provincial and territorial level on the plan?
Yes. After the first week, it's become clear that the situation, as I said, has become a lot more complex and a lot more volatile. And it seemed that there was a bit of confusion about whose responsibility it is to deal with enforcing the law, or is there capacity enough locally to enforce the law? So I was proactive in reaching out to my provincial counterpart, particularly in Alberta, in Ontario, in BC as well, and in Manitoba.
Let's start with your efforts to engage with Ontario. The time frame I'm going to concentrate on, just to get the matter focused quickly, is the sort of February 7th, 8th, 9th time frame. So we are at the point where the convoy has put down roots, so to speak, in Ottawa. There are other events at Coutts and Emerson. And if I could ask the clerk to call up SSM CAN 405289. And Minister Alghabra, this will be a text, a series of texts between you and Minister Mulroney, Carolyn Mulroney of the province of Ontario. And would you describe her as your counterpart in the Ontario government?
Correct.
Yes. And if you can just look at the text there, see if that reminds you of the exchange you had. It might not be necessary for us to go to the ones on the 8th and 9th, though if that would help you remember, we can. Can you tell us what you were attempting to do with Minister Mulroney of the Ontario government with respect to the effort you've just been describing?
Sure. I talked about how the idea of a strategic enforcement strategies come to being. I just want to add another context to this, is that we were looking for tools that will help end the blockades and the occupation with as minimum confrontation as possible too. So that's where the idea of utilizing some of the provincial powers that they have in regulating commercial vehicles became obvious, because it really will create I don't want to call it an incentive, but certainly dissuade people who are using commercial vehicles from using them illegally, and hopefully discourage people who are thinking of joining the occupation to realize that there's significant consequences. So that's where the idea has come about. And I wanted to, when we finalized or developed this, it wasn't completely finalized, but when we have the the outline of what we were thinking, I reached out to Minister Maroney to share with her what we have put in place or what we are proposing. So I texted her on Monday. By the way, also that day I had participated in a press conference with my colleagues, Minister LeBlanc and Minister Mendicino. We felt it was, up until that moment, the federal government had not spoken out publicly about our role or in dealing with the blockades and the occupation. So I reached out to her and I asked if she would have time to speak with me so I can share with her what I thought was constructive ideas. And
how did that go?
Well, as you can see from the response, she said that she's heard my comments through the media, because in my comments at the press conference, I did outline some ideas that the provincial governments can use. And she responded saying that our deputies are in communication and she would get back to me later.
And Clerk, if I could ask that you call up WPS 506, maybe 966. Now, this is a bit of a longer document, Mr. Clerk, and you can either word search potato or scroll down until you come to it. It's a fair way. It's a cluttered document, and it's hard to find. It's a fair ways in. And you'll come to a heading, Protests a Political Hot Potato. There we go. Thank you. And can you tell me what this, as I say, it's a bit of a cluttered document and there's a lot happening in it, but do you recognize this?
No. Is this an article?
Yes, an account, a readout of multiple events. But if we look at the paragraphs under Protests a Political Hot Potato, the first paragraph reads, and I'll quote, "There are growing calls for Ford to get more involved in bringing the protest to an end. After all, Ottawa and Windsor are in Ontario." And then this is a quotation from you. "I call on the government of Ontario to join us in securing an end to these illegal blockades in several Ontario cities and to apply the law," Transport Minister Omar Alghabra told a news conference on Wednesday. Now, was this part of your effort to get Ontario engaged in the enforcement plan?
Yes.
And were you briefed by your deputy or your other staff on the reasons that Ontario was giving for not being fully enthusiastic about the enforcement plan?
There's a lot of speculation, but it's not my really. I can't give you a reason that I feel I can speak on behalf of the Ontario government, but there was a lot of speculation about the apparent hesitation.
Right, but one thing I was wondering if your deputy or your staff briefed you on was the concern, certainly that the lawyers observing the situation could have had, which is that if you start using enforcement mechanisms for what might be called an ulterior purpose or for some objective other than those mechanisms were designed for, you run into legal issues, including the procedural fairness that has to be applied before the enforcement can be effective, before it can take effect. So you recognized that there were genuine issues that Ontario was concerned about before it could become fully invested in the enforcement plan?
I mean, I think it was clear, even through my direct conversations with Minister Maroney, that we have a difference of opinion. We had a difference of opinion. In my understanding, in my opinion, we were asking for the laws to be applied. We were not asking for an extra interpretation of the law. We thought the laws are what the laws are, and they can be applied to help mitigate or deal with the illegal blockades and occupation.
Okay, well, that's helpful. And then, and as I understand it from our interview on February 9th, you met with Minister Mulroney to pursue this issue further. And can you tell us about that meeting?
Yes. The in between the text and the meeting, her deputy had sent my deputy an official response to our outreach, and in that response, they outlined why that our request was not doable.
And that's on the record. So thank you for pinpointing that in this chronology. Yes.
And she texted me a copy of that letter, but I still asked if it's possible to have a conversation with her, and that's when we ended up virtually meeting. And we, as I said, it was clear that we had a different opinion on how to deal with it. She thought that this was a federal jurisdiction. And I was saying that the roads that the blockaders and the occupiers were on were under municipal or provincial jurisdiction, and we hoped that the province would take the lead and utilize their existing laws and enforcement to apply the law. And so we had a difference of opinion on who should take the lead on this.
Right. Maybe you could flesh that out a little bit. I mean, it's a federal problem in the sense that there's serious problems in Ottawa by this stage, at Coutts, at some of the other ports of entry. But I understand that the message you were trying to get across to Minister Mulroney is that it was primarily the provincial enforcement tools that would be able to solve the problem. Is that the gist of it?
That is correct.
Yeah. Clerk, could you call up, please, SSM NSC CAN 50256? Can you tell us who Mike Macca is, Minister?
He's my chief of staff.
Thank you. This is an email. If it'll come up in a second, it'll be an email chain. And if we can just scroll down to page 2 and there we go, a readout of your meeting with a member of Parliament, and I'm sorry, you might be better at that name than I am.
Kuzmerchek.
Kuzmerchek, thank you. Who, as I understand it, is a Liberal MP from Windsor, Ontario.
Correct.
Thanks. And can you tell us about that? I mean, the clerk can help you scroll down through the notes if you'd like to remind yourself, but it might be that by looking at the points there, you can be reminded of what it was you talked about and what it was of concern to you and your colleague.
Well, I was doing a lot of outreach at the time, and my colleague and friend, Eric Kuzmerchek, has also wanted to convey to me the facts on the ground as he sees them in Windsor and the impact that the bridge blockade has had on the community. From automotive sector to retailers to law enforcement, to trade. So he reached out to share with me what he's seeing, his community's sentiments, and to inquire about what else can we do as a federal government, what else can I do as a member of Parliament to help deal with the reality and the pain that the people of Windsor are dealing with.
Right. And then by now, I think most of us know what happened very shortly after that meeting on February 10th, when Ontario adopted its emergency measures order. And can you tell me how that had an impact on your perspective of things going forward once Ontario was, if I can put it this way, more on side with the approach that you'd been trying to encourage them to take?
I was relieved that the Ontario government is taking that measure. They certainly, what I feel, built on the advice or the suggestions that we proposed to them. And I was relieved to see that the government of Ontario had taken that step.
And I'd like to take you to your international effort, because I suppose not exclusively, but perhaps primarily with respect to the Ambassador Bridge, but presumably with all of the border points, you also, in terms of your ministry's multi-jurisdictional efforts to coordinate your transportation function with those of the other jurisdictions in which the vehicles have to travel, you also have a relationship with officials in the United States, correct?
That's correct.
And with Mr. Buttigieg in particular?
That's correct.
Okay. And did you engage with him when Ambassador Bridge was becoming problematic?
Yes. In fact, he had reached out to me and we scheduled the call. He wanted to express the concerns that the U.S. government and what he's hearing from industry that is being caused by the blockades at the Ambassador Bridge.
So do you have many interactions with Mr. Buttigieg that begin with him reaching out to you?
No. Usually I'm the one who's trying to reach out to him to advocate for Canada's interest.
Right. And here he's probably not indifferent to Canada's concerns because it's a symbiotic relationship, but he's calling you because he's feeling his constituency is feeling the impact of the Ambassador Bridge on nearby ports of entry blockages. Is that right?
Indeed, the Ambassador Bridge is the most important port of entry that connects our two countries. It's an average $400 million a day of trade that crosses that bridge, and when it's shut down, and also given the just-in-time business model that many in the auto sector and other sectors use, that blockade caused a significant disruption to supply chains, to businesses on both sides of the border.
Right. Mr. Clerk, if you could call up WTS 6075 and go to page 6. This, by the way, this meeting with Mr. Buttigieg was on February 10th. This is the summary of your interview, and you discussed this at page 6, where the clerk has put you there. Call with Secretary of State Pete Buttigieg. Now, if we look after the introductory paragraph to the introduction to a quote from you, and I'll read the introduction and a quotation. It says, Minister Alghabra was asked about the following statement he had made in the course of his call with Secretary Buttigieg. So for the context of the readers, that's me or one of my colleagues asking you to elaborate on this statement. In the course of our interview with you, we've asked you to elaborate. This is a statement you made during your call with Secretary Buttigieg. But I can tell you, and I just spoke to the Prime Minister, that we are running out of patience. If things aren't addressed in the very near term, we as the federal government will step in. And at that point, this is February 10th, as is noted at the top of the page there, was it your understanding that you and your colleagues in cabinet were contemplating the options that would include federal intervention to find solutions to the blockades and the convoys?
I can't recall specifically if the conversation in cabinet about the second track of the Emergency Act had happened before this call or after. But I could tell you that my intention, and this, maybe I should explain the conversation first, because in the conversation, I explained the secretary certainly was anxious and wanted to know when, if I could give an estimate, when will this end and how quickly can port of entry be reopened. And I was explaining to him the complexity of enforcement and whose responsibility, and that our federal government is not able to direct police to how to operate their law enforcement. So I gave him a context of how the complexity of the situation, but at the same time, I wanted to reassure him that this was an important matter, and that yes, despite the complexity, that we're going to do everything we can at the federal level to fix this issue. So it was, for me, it was intended not, I could say, even if we had started the conversation, I wasn't sure where we're going to go at the federal level, but I wanted to give him a sense of confidence that this is a priority for us and that we will do what we can to deal with it as quickly as possible.
Now, right about then, in the course of your discussions with Secretary Buttigieg, Ontario invoked its emergency order, and would it be fair to say that that went some way to address the concerns and take the pressure off you, at least temporarily, and in particular, Secretary Buttigieg would be able to see that things were happening and enforcement might be not far in the future?
As I said, while it offered me relief to see the provincial government up its participation or its role in dealing with the illegal blockades and occupation, the outcome was still that the point of entry was closed. So that was the eventual concern for Secretary Buttigieg and for me, to be precise. And yes, we could see that now new tools are provided to law enforcement, but we still couldn't see the end, of the blockades. There was a lot of fluidity and volatility in what was happening at Windsor or across the country, to be honest, because at different blockades, even the one in Windsor, we would hear reduction in size, growth in size, a clearance on one side, but maybe still a tenuous situation where the law. So while yes, it offered some comfort, but we still had the roads closed.
Okay, let's move ahead a few days, and Mr. Clerk, if you can call up SSM NSC CAN 400214. These would be the IRG meeting minutes for February 12th. And if we go through to page 7, and if you scroll down to about almost halfway, there we go. The Minister of Transport confirmed, etc. So that's you, Minister Alghabra, reporting, as I'm inferring here, you're reporting to the IRG about developments. And if we go down to just above the redaction, where again, the words the minister is underlined, and I'll read that out. The minister confirmed that he is working with provinces on securing tow trucks and that Alberta is looking to purchase at least 2 large tow trucks. other provinces have been offered support to facilitate purchase agreements or services relating to tow trucks, but have shown interest to date.
I think it means maybe have shown no interest.
I was going to say that sentence only makes sense if the typist intended to say, but have shown no interest to date. But let me ask you to confirm that. Was that the fact that Alberta was buying some, but the others, even though you'd offered them financial support to facilitate the purchase, they hadn't shown interest to date?
That is correct. Right. And if I may, can I talk about the first part of the paragraph?
Yes, please.
So to explain what I was briefing to my colleagues, again, taking everyone back in time to that moment, there were a lot of threats emerging across the country to various ports of entries and institutions. We had heard threats to the Port of Halifax, slow rolls in airport in Ottawa, Pearson Airport in Toronto, the Port of Vancouver. So what we did proactively, reach out to all or as many as we can to those ports of entry, to different institutions, including rail companies, to just encourage them to be alert, to perhaps increase their security, and to have plans in case any of these blockaders or slow rollers start appearing outside their institution.
And with respect to your effort to encourage the provinces to obtain heavy lift tow truck capacity, did Ontario express any interest in participating in a program like that?
Not that I recall.
Okay, thanks. Now, at the end of that paragraph, we see a report on the situation at Manitoba, which I'll just summarize by saying Manitoba said, we're doing okay on our own, thanks. So your sense was that Manitoba wasn't interested it wasn't sensing that it had a problem serious enough to become involved in the assistance you were offering, is that it?
Yeah, I mean, I can't describe why, but they certainly, the minister and I think it was officials actually at the time, they were not indicating any interest in any support from the federal government.
Okay, moving ahead chronologically, Mr. Clerk, if we can turn up the same prefix, but with the last four digits being 0401, we're now moving ahead to the IRG minutes of the 16th, so we're now post-invocation. Before we jump over that, is there anything that you think is important to this chronology that involves your particular involvement in the decision of Cabinet to invoke the Emergencies Act?
Sure. I mean, that is I guess the question that yes. I had to deal with, and so did my colleagues. And I kind of alluded to it in my previous response, is that again, that moment in time, there was a lot of concern about ongoing escalation and inspiration that these blockades and occupations had been causing. And it felt, as I said, that it wasn't just Ottawa, it wasn't just Windsor, it was Sarnia, it was Cornwall, it was Emerson, it was Coutts, it was Surrey, it was the Port of Vancouver, it was the Port of Halifax. All that to say is that there have been reports of either threats or some form of slow roll, some form of protest, and it felt that there was a stalemate, and that stalemate was raising the temperature. Occupiers and blockaders were becoming more entrenched. Those who opposed them were also becoming more entrenched in opposing them. So there was a sense of a stalemate and a risk to many people, including those who were participating in the blockades, that this could get out of hand, that we could be reaching a tipping point where it could escalate and we would look back and regret not doing something sooner. And not to mention, by the way, the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Canadians who have been personally impacted, either through their livelihood or their quality of life, businesses that I heard from. So there's been this situation across the country was getting into a really period of a lot of, I would say, concern about where this is going to head if we don't end up doing something. And I know I grappled with that decision. I didn't take that decision lightly. And I would say I was reluctant to do that decision, but it was the right thing to do to protect Canada's national interest, to protect Canada's security, to protect Canadians. And at a time like that, yes, the Emergencies Act is for emergencies, and it felt like an emergency.
Now, let me back up a little bit to, we mentioned your involvement and your department's involvement in the enforcement strategy, the strategic enforcement strategy. Your deputy described a companion strategy that your department was working on, the tow truck strategy. And as you were meeting with the IRG, is it fair to say that you weren't the only one around the table who realized that the ability to tow these vehicles was problematic in the situations both at the border points and in Ottawa?
I don't want to speak on behalf of my colleagues or breach cabinet confidentiality.
And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply that. Just it's your brief, so you tell.
So yeah, I certainly felt that having access to tow trucks was an issue. We for weeks been asking, or we've been told that it was near impossible, if not impossible, to find tow truck operators who are willing to take the risk to participate in a law enforcement action. So that was a common feedback that I heard from the department, from others. So it was clear to me that availability of tow trucks, and not just any tow trucks, by the way, we're talking about specialized tow trucks, was the availability was an issue.
And so again, recognizing that I have to be more careful about the questions I ask you than I asked your deputy. But what we know is that part of what came out of the emergency measures order was an authority to compel tow truck service providers to provide towing services. And so is it safe to say that that was an element of the emergency legislation that you considered an important part of the overall solution? Indeed.
Look, I think it was really important that the Emergencies Act is precise, is targeted, and is measured. And the tool to compel tow truck operators was very specific and narrow and necessary to help law enforcement deal with the blockades.
Okay. And we have, thank you, Clerk, the document for the February 16th IRG meeting minutes. And if we can go down to page 7, about just a quarter of the way from the top, immediately after the redaction, right? So here you are reporting, and because this is unredacted, you're allowed to talk about this. Somebody has decided that it's fair game. And it says, the Minister of Transport confirmed that tow truck capacity challenges appear to be resolved, with Alberta and Ontario confirming that they have appropriate towing capacity. And that speaks for itself, because I don't want to ask you to expand on that in case it would involve a confidence of cabinet. But we can get some insight from your on this point from your witness statement. And then, can you call that up, Mr. Clerk? I think I introduced it at the beginning as
75.
Thank you. And if we go to page 8 of that, this is, again, so the reader puts it in context, this is the summary of your interview with a commission counsel a few months ago. And you note roughly the same here as you did to Cabinet. Minister Alghabra noted that a key proposal for emergency measures was the power to compel tow truck drivers to comply with an order to assist in removing vehicles, which was inspired by Transport Canada's tow truck strategy. And then it goes on to stipulate, in fact, that this measure ensured adequate resources and equipment were available to clear the blockades. Do you remember that part of your interview?
Yes.
Now, an issue that you might have heard talked about, it depends how closely you've been following the proceedings. I think there's, what I think is not contentious is that not long after the enactment of the invocation of the Emergencies Act, trucks did get towed, and that some documentation indicates, mostly documentation where the tow truck drivers are seeking to get paid for their services, that at least the mechanism for compensating tow truck drivers who were asked to provide services or compelled to provide services under the Act, that part of the system worked. But I wonder if you followed the evidence closely enough to have observed the observations made by some of the police, and in particular Ottawa and OPP witnesses who've spoken about the fact that they already had tow trucks lined up and available, willing to provide service, and that in fact those arrangements pre-existed the Emergencies Act and could have been used without the enactment of the Emergencies Act. Have you followed that evidence and that point of issue?
I haven't been able to follow all of the proceedings, but I got reports on what is being said, and I'll share with you my perspective. Throughout these weeks of outreach and discussions and debates, no one has said that the tow truck issue was resolved. In fact, in all of my conversations prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, availability of tow trucks was always highlighted as an issue, and that tow truck operators were worried about their safety, were worried about their business. Those trucks, particularly ones in Ottawa, needed a specialized tow truck and tow truck drivers, and that it was an issue. Having access to tow trucks that could do this was an issue. And again, the tow trucks did not appear until after the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So I can't speak to what the others have been testifying, but I could tell you that that's what I had heard. That was my understanding. And again, the facts is that the tow trucks did not appear until after the Emergencies Act was invoked.
Thank you for that. Now, those are all of the specific questions I have for you, but I'd like to finish up by asking you if you have anything you'd like to add, just general observations or things you think it's important for the Commissioner to hear. And in that category, if you have recommendations about things that could have been done differently if different protocols or legislation or whatever had been in place when you were trying to develop your enforcement strategy and trying to develop your tow truck strategy, those types of points would be helpful to the Commission.
I just want to go back to the picture that I tried to draw for you about the situation and how heightened the sense of anxiety and concern for public safety, for economic well-being of our country was how, at the time, cities and municipalities were asking us to do something. Provincial governments were saying this is a federal issue. Opposition parties were asking us questions. Why aren't you doing something? Canadians were asking us. Businesses were asking. We didn't talk about several interaction that I had with associations that represented different industries, including the trucking industry. They were all, and I looked them in the eye and I heard it in their voice, the panic, the fear, the concern that they have, the shifts that were shut down, the businesses that were closed down, the people who couldn't go to hospitals. That was the moment that we were living. And it felt like we had to do something. We were, again, it was not something that we took lightly. It was not something that I took lightly. But it was the context that we're in, the fear of escalation, the fear of getting to a tipping point where it could get out of hand. That was, I strongly believe that was invoking the Emergencies Act. Again, it was very precise and limited, was necessary. As to your second question, I think it's clear that this incident has exposed some gaps, whether it is, the issue of jurisdictions, whether it is, do we need additional tools to protect critical infrastructure? I think those are important questions. And in fact, I've tasked my department to do some work on what can be done to strengthen federal legislation or tools to add additional maybe set of tools to protect critical infrastructure.
Along those lines, let me just follow up with a question that takes us right back to the very beginning of your evidence, Minister Alghabra. You talked about the fact that you have at least an annual meeting of a council of ministers of transportation at the federal and provincial and territorial level. Do you think that if at the next one of your meetings you put your heads together to see if you could come up with plans, procedures, and protocols so that you're not trying to invent this thing from the start the next time a problem like this arises, that the officials themselves, perhaps even without new legislation or perhaps with a view to fashioning appropriate legislation, could advance the situation?
I think absolutely. By the way, we did have a council of ministers after that incident. Typically, we have them in February. And I think it's really important to collaborate with provincial governments on clarifying these what appear to be misconceptions or miscommunication or misunderstanding, but also identifying tools. I'll just note, for example, the Alberta government has its own critical infrastructure legislation. So perhaps we can also learn from the government of Alberta and other provincial governments on what else we could do at the federal level and how we can collaborate on closing these gaps.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Commissioner. Those are my questions.
Okay. So if I could first call on the Democracy Fund, JCCF, please.
Good evening, Minister.
Good evening.
I'm Hatem Kir, Counsel for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. So right from the start of the pandemic, while people like you and I had the opportunity to work from home, truckers still had to go out and keep the goods moving, right?
Right.
And that's why they were originally designated as essential service providers, and they were exempted from the vaccine mandate, right?
So first of all, let me just say that truckers over the last 2 years have done an amazing job. Like you said, when many of us had the option of working from home, they kept the movement of goods going. Most of us never thought for a moment about how these products got to the shelves, but we certainly were reminded of the importance of the industry when everything else was shut down, yet the products kept on arriving. So I don't think we could say thank you enough to truckers for their professionalism and for their job. And to answer your question about how policies were developed throughout the pandemic, these were done given the based on the advice that we received from public health, and also taking into account considerations of the realities on the ground. And there have been several professions and several categories that were granted exemptions at the beginning of the pandemic.
And truckers were one of them?
Truckers were one of them.
Okay, and you note in your witness statement that the protests arose in response to the elimination of that designation, correct?
My understanding is that the protests rose to oppose all mandates, not just truckers' mandate.
But you state in your interview summary, which you adopted, it states that your understanding was that the protest arose in response to the elimination of that designation, right?
I think it was a trigger, but again, I am not here to speak on behalf of the protesters, but my understanding is that in every communication they issued, they opposed all vaccine mandates.
Okay, can we please pull up JCF 50191? And while that's being pulled up, just for the benefit of my friends, this is a compilation of documents that are listed individually in the database. I'll mention their IDs as we go through. I'm just using this to save a bit of time as we pull up documents. Minister, you can recognize that this is this appears to be a news release from the province of Alberta, correct?
This is the first time I'm seeing this document, and that's what the headline says.
Okay, and again, for the record, this is individually in the database as JCF 50192. Now, you see the title where it says Alberta takes steps to safely return to normal, correct?
Right. Yes.
With the date of February 8th just above that?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, and if we go down to page 2, Mr. Clerk, Minister, do you see at the second paragraph, it says Alberta will remove all the restriction exemption program and capacity limits under 500, right?
Okay, that's what it says.
And then if we go to page 3, it sets out a schedule for other restrictions being lifted, right?
I mean, again, I have not seen this document before, and I'm only seeing what is being in front of me on the screen. So it says step 2, step 3. So I'm assuming that what you're saying is correct.
And you, I take it you were aware that this was happening at the time in February, at least in the broad strokes?
Yeah, I mean, again, as I said, all governments, not just in Canada, provincial, municipal, around the world, had different public health measures, including mandates, and all governments had their own plan of how to adjust these measures.
Okay, and then if we go to page 7 in this document, which for the record is in the database is JCF 50193, this is a Manitoba news release dated February 11th, right?
It appears that way.
And the title says that Manitoba accelerating plan to reduce public health restrictions based on improving COVID-19 situation.
That's what the headline says.
And again, were you aware of Manitoba's action at the time?
Again, I was aware that different governments had their own plan of adjusting their public health measures. So did we.
Well, you might start to notice a pattern I'm getting at, but perhaps we can go to page 9 in this document, Mr. Clerk, which for the record is JCF 50190. We see an Ontario announcement dated February 14th, right?
Yeah.
And it announces that Ontario is moving to its next phase of reopening on the 17th.
Okay.
And just just for the sake of completion, lastly, if we just go to page 14, which for the record is JCF 50194, this is a Saskatchewan news release titled "Living with COVID, Proof of Vaccination No Longer Required, Business Verifier App Discontinued," correct?
That's what the headline says?
Okay, so you said you were aware that different jurisdictions were taking their own responses. What I'd suggest to you is that given the timing of these measures all being taken by the different provinces, that they were being taken as a step by the provinces to respond to the concerns of protesters. Would you agree with that?
No? Is that what you think?
I'm suggesting that to you.
No, well, I don't think so. But at the end of the day, it's up to the government. The government, none of these governments have shared with me their rationale. I'm assuming that just like they impose these measures based on their advice that they received, I'm assuming they're adjusting their measures based on the advice that they receive and their own considerations.
Well, we heard yesterday that at the first ministers' meeting relating to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, that Premier Kenney asked the federal government to lift the vaccine mandate as it applied to truckers crossing the border. And he mentioned that he had raised that previously. I don't believe you were at that meeting, but were you aware of his opinion?
I was not at that meeting. I think he had made it public. I just can't remember when he made it public, his opposition to border truckers crossing the borders mandate.
Well, we also saw a text from Premier Kenney, which was forwarded to you by Minister LeBlanc, where Premier Kenney called the trucker vaccine mandate, quote, "dumb political theater," end quote. Do you remember receiving that?
I do.
So again, given these comments from Premier Kenney and the timing of the provinces, you still maintain that none of this was in response to the protests?
Again, you'll have to ask the provinces that question. I'm not in a position to offer justification for a provincial government's decision.
Well, given the motivation of the protesters, did the government consider resuming the exemption for truckers?
And by the way, let me just clarify, and again, it's not up to me to talk about provincial governments' decisions, but they did not. Most governments, provincial governments, did not lift all mandates. So just for the record. Second, we don't make public policy based on the number of protesters or emails that we get. We make public policy, particularly during the pandemic. And let me be the first to acknowledge, governments around the world, including the federal government, did extraordinary measures in what we believed was the right thing to protect the health and safety of Canadians. I never imagined provinces shutting down businesses. I never imagined provinces invoking curfews. I never imagined the federal government putting limitation on travel. But we all did that. Governments across Canada did these measures because we believed we are saving lives. And yes, they were extraordinary, but I could tell you, no one, at least us, I'm not making any apology for doing what we believed the best thing for protecting lives. Now, of course, it caused inconvenience. Of course, it caused disruption, and our government did whatever we can to mitigate those disruptions. And Canadians understood that. Canadians understood that. So back to your question, our policies were based on the advice and facts and the science that we receive, not based on polls or number of protesters or even the illegal activities that should never drive public policy.
So the government should never change its policies in response to outcry from protesters?
I'm saying governments, especially during pandemic, made tough decisions based on what we believed was the best for the protection of the health and safety of Canadians. Now, if you're asking me, should government change its policy because people break the law in expressing their opposition I say no. Should the government listen to public and consider the sentiment of public? Of course, but we are guided by the interest of Canadian, protecting the interest of Canadians. So being aware of the sentiment of Canadian is different than advancing the interest of Canadians. Sometimes they're connected. Sometimes the sentiment might be different depending on the groups and the information that they have or the priorities that they have.
I'm going to suggest to you that the government couldn't reconsider its removal of that exemption because it had already relabeled the truckers and the protesters as white supremacists and now had to maintain its opposition to anything associated with the protest.
Yeah, no, I don't agree with you. First of all, truckers themselves, if you followed the press releases by the Canadian Trucking Association, by Teamsters, the unions that represent many truck drivers, have distanced themselves from these illegal blockades and occupations. They said they're giving the industry a bad name. They do not represent the industry. So I've had several meetings with representatives of trucking associations, of trucking companies, and they all felt that they're giving the trucking industry a bad name. Second, let me just highlight a second point, by the way. We actually eased our international travel measures, and I can't remember exact date, but sometime in February, where there was a requirement for upon arrival testing. Those tests were eliminated. And that wasn't because of the illegal occupation. It was because we entered a different phase of the pandemic, and we felt, based on the advice that we got, we could adjust and ease our measures. So we did that.
And one of the other things that the government did was invoke the Emergencies Act to deal with the protests, right?
Say that again?
One of the other things done in February was, of course, the invocation of the Emergencies Act while we're here.
That is correct.
And I understand that the invocation of the Emergencies Act was not intended to infringe upon anyone's charter rights, correct?
It was specifically stated in the provisions of the Act.
And so first of all, I understand that the cabinet then would have turned its collective mind to that when discussing the invocation.
We considered
Sorry,
all.
as far as you're asking what cabinet deliberated, that's protected by cabinet confidence.
Okay, fair enough. Suffice it to say, cabinet's intention was to protect the charter rights of Canadians.
That's our constitution, and we're all sworn to uphold our constitution.
Do you believe cabinet protected the charter rights of tow truck drivers?
We kept in mind the charter rights of all Canadians, including truck drivers.
You'd agree that tow truck drivers weren't protesters themselves, aside from perhaps individual cases?
I don't understand the question.
Well, so you said in your interview summary that some tow truck drivers refused to tow trucks out of sympathy with the protests, right?
I said that, yes, there was a reluctance for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons may be because they might be sympathetic, but the bigger reasons that we heard is that they were afraid for their livelihood and their safety.
Well, I want to focus on the group that was objecting out of sympathy with the protest. You'd agree that they may have done so out of political or moral reasons?
I can't really speak on their behalf.
You'd agree that the emergency measures regulation compelled tow truck drivers to serve a cause that was potentially contrary to their beliefs if they were refusing out of sympathy with the protest?
You know, again, the Emergencies Act was necessary given the circumstances. The tools within the Emergencies Act were necessary to end illegal activities, including blockades and occupation. And in order for us to de-escalate the situation and to end these illegal activities, we needed access to tow trucks, making sure that tow truck drivers were compensated and made whole. And I'm pretty sure that I can't speak about the selection of tow truck drivers and tow truck companies, how the law enforcement agencies in choosing them. So I'm sure they found those who were willing as long as they felt they were compensated and protected.
Minister, I'm out of time, but I'm just gonna push back on that one answer you gave me, because I asked you if tow truck drivers who would have refused out of sympathy with the protest, as you highlighted in your interview statement, would have been compelled by the emergency measure regulations to serve a cause that they did not agree with, and you responded by talking about the necessity of it. But I'm asking you, were those people compelled to serve a cause that they felt went against their conscience and their choice of association?
So I answered the question by saying I was not involved in how tow truck drivers or tow truck companies were selected. I would like to think that there were options to select tow truck drivers who were willing to participate.
You'd like to think that, but certainly the power created that opportunity, right?
I was not involved in the selection of tow truck drivers.
Okay, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, if I could call on the City of Windsor, please.
Minister Alghabra.
Hi.
My name is Jennifer King. I am legal counsel to the City of Windsor.
Hi, Councillor.
I only have hopefully a few questions for you to clarify a few points. So first, I have some questions about the strategic enforcement strategy. Both you and your deputy minister have testified about this strategy. I'll ask the clerk to bring it up just in case we need to look at it. It is PBCAN 50860. And I understand that there was never a final version, and my understanding is that Deputy Minister Keenan agreed that this was the final version. So this strategy, as it's coming up, I think you'll agree with me that the strategy recognizes that given the complexity of the occupations and blockades, safe resolution requires 3 levels of government to collaborate, right?
Yes,
And do you agree with that?
I do.
And the strategy calls on all levels of government to deliver key messages, including that the blockades were breaking municipal bylaws.
I agree.
And the strategy lists examples of municipal bylaws, including Windsor bylaws, right?
Correct.
Deputy Minister Keenan confirmed last week that Transport Canada did not consult with Windsor on this strategy, nor did Transport Canada consult with Windsor Police. He said that we left both of those to our provincial colleagues. Are you aware of that?
I was not aware of the level of consultation that took place. I was just aware that there's significant consultation that had taken place in putting this document together.
Okay, but if Deputy Minister Keenan said that he didn't consult with the municipality of Windsor, you would defer to him?
I would defer to him.
And you didn't consult with the municipality on the strategy?
I had a meeting, by the way, with Mayor Dilkins. I think February 11th, I think. So I certainly reached out. I know my colleague, Minister Medicino, has also reached out. So I put an effort into making sure that I heard directly from the mayor. You saw that I also had spoken with my colleague, Eric Kuzmerchik, Member of Parliament from Windsor. So it was really important for me to hear directly from those who are representing Windsor about the experience that they're going through and ideas that they may have.
Right, and we'll talk about that call that you had with Mayor Dilkins in a few moments. But I take it that you didn't specifically ask for input on the tools that you were putting into this strategy.
Again, the strategy was developed, put together by officials based on my request. And I know, and the idea was to consult our stakeholders, our key partners. But I'm not able to answer your question about the level of engagement and who exactly was involved in this development.
Thank you. Okay, so let me put it to you this way. When you're in a situation, and you've already talked about your call with Minister Mulrooney on February the 9th, and in your witness statement, you state that in that call, Minister Mulrooney advised you that Transport Canada's enforcement proposals were simply unworkable. That's what she told you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that was the exact word, but maybe it was, but saying that what we were proposing was not doable.
Okay, So if you're in this kind of situation where your provincial colleagues are maybe not on board at the moment, and you're in a situation where safe resolution requires 3 levels of government to collaborate, wouldn't you agree that you should reach out directly to consult with the impacted municipalities on this kind of strategy?
Again, I reached out to Mayor Dilkens and I had a conversation with him to hear from him about what's going on, to get a briefing from him, and then I offered him what else can we do to help. So I had direct conversation with the mayor, as I said, my other colleagues as well.
Right. And so it is important to reach out directly to the municipality then. You agree?
I think so.
Yeah. Deputy Minister Keenan also confirmed that Transport Canada would not have shared the strategy with Windsor after it was finalized, and again relied on Transport Canada's provincial partners to share it as they saw fit. And he didn't know if it had been shared. I take it you did not share the strategy with Windsor.
I didn't, but again, the document was about provincial and federal tools, and mostly provincial tools. So it made, I guess, sense. And again, I shouldn't be talking about what exactly happened because I wasn't involved in it, but maybe I'm attempting at understanding what happened.
Right. And so we did get some clarity on that from the Deputy Minister. I can tell you that I'm not aware of any evidence that Windsor received it. I just wanted to confirm with you that if the purpose of the strategy was to coordinate with 3 levels of government, wouldn't it have been important then to ensure that all levels of government had a copy?
Councillor, at the risk of repeating myself, my colleague, Mr. Kuzmerchak, my colleague, Minister Mendicino, perhaps others have reached out to the mayor to ensure that we are still in touch and in contact. We offered, we solicited input, we offered help. So I guess what I'm trying to demonstrate is that we've actually done that.
No, and I can see, and we'll talk, perhaps Mr. Clerk, you can pull up SSM CAN 50981. And I can see that there was a reach out to Mayor Dilkens, and this is referenced in the institutional report from Windsor, absolutely. And Mayor Dilkens said that there was excellent communication with the different levels of government. I was just trying to confirm with this strategy that was an important strategy that Transport Canada had worked on, why it didn't get to the local authorities that were on the ground.
Yeah, I can't answer that question because I wasn't involved in the day-to-day put together of this strategy.
Thank you. And so I just wanted to perhaps refresh your memory. This is a memo. Who's Samara Khan?
She is a former employee of mine.
Okay. And so this is a memo that she prepared for you reflecting your meeting with Mayor Dilkens.
Yes, it's a briefing note before a call.
Okay, so I just have a couple of clarification questions about this call because you hadn't referenced it in your witness summary, and I'm not sure if it matters, but you had said that the call was maybe on the February the 11th. I think that was Mayor Dilkens' recollection. This document seems to be dated February 10th.
Oh, it's not uncommon that my staff prepares a briefing note the night before so I can read it overnight in preparation for my meeting. And the briefing note tends to cover a variety of issues in case any other topic is approached when I'm speaking with whoever I'm being prepared for.
And then your staff would insert the notes from the call. Is that what we have here?
I don't know. I think this is the actual briefing note. I don't know if it has the readout of the call. I think this is the actual briefing note.
Okay, so when it says current status and it has notes about what Mayor Dilkens is saying, this is not notes from the call?
No. This is preparing me for what's the latest activities that have been happening there.
Okay, so if you could just scroll down to the second page. So you're aware at this point then that the city, along with the APMA, is seeking an injunction. Yeah, and on the second page, you'll see at the top, it states that the OPP has been sent to Windsor to assist with the situation, and RCMP are sending a public order unit based in Ontario to assist alongside the OPP in Windsor. So you were aware of that as of around February 10th?
Yeah, as I said, this was a note prepared by my team to prepare me for the call. And the idea is to make sure that I'm up to date on the ongoing activities.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. And my last question is, Minister Alghabra, you told my friend Commission Counsel earlier that you tasked your department with what can be done to federal legislation and tools to protect critical infrastructure. Did you task your department to consult with border municipalities and other partners in considering these changes and tools?
I mean, we're not at that stage yet. Perhaps we will get there. But for now, the idea is to put together a simple proposal on what additional tools we need. And then what we would do is we would then talk to our partners. For sure, it would make sense, municipalities that have such critical infrastructure, to seek their input.
Okay, thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next is former Chief Slowly's counsel, please.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Nicholas DeStefano for Chief Slowly. We've ceded our time to the Government of Canada.
Okay. OPP.
Chris Diana for the OPP, and we likewise have no questions and have ceded our time to Government of Canada.
Oh my God. Okay. I don't know. That's going to be a long. Okay. Windsor Police Service.
Hi there, Heather Patterson for the Windsor Police Service. We have no questions.
Okay. And the Government of Alberta, please.
Good afternoon. It's Mandy England for the Government of Alberta. We do have some questions, and I'm wondering if we might be able to take the time for the Windsor Police Service that they weren't able to use this afternoon.
But there wasn't an offer made, but let me, and you owe me 5 minutes from the last time. But let's go and see where we go.
Fair enough. Thank you very much, Commissioner. Minister, you will agree with me that in your communications with Minister Sani before February the 13th, that you did not raise or discuss the Federal Emergencies Act. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to take you to some comments that were made in your witness statement, and I would ask if that could please be pulled up just so you can see it. It's at WTS, I believe it's 6075 at page 4. And as it's being pulled up, the first comment that I'd like to draw your attention to is, nonetheless, his, being your assessment, was that some provincial governments, for example, Ontario and Alberta, viewed the issue as an issue falling under federal jurisdiction requiring federal intervention. And so if I could paraphrase colloquially the request that the Government of Alberta did make for assistance to the federal government, it was, it's our information that you own some heavy lift tow trucks that are sitting in our province, and we would like to borrow them. So would you agree with me that that request was not the same thing as saying, responding to this event doesn't fall under Alberta's jurisdiction, this falls under federal jurisdiction?
First of all, it was actually a comment that was mentioned to me by Minister Sani that they also see this as, because it's a point of entry, they see that the federal government is implicated in this. And that the federal government needed to play a leadership role on it. So this was based on a comment that I had received from the minister. Second, I think I can't, comment on the RFA. That's not necessarily where my comment had come from.
Okay, thank you. And so in terms of, the issue that there was a port of entry, I understand you as saying that there was a role, but not that it was a matter solely of federal jurisdiction. Alberta did not in any way imply that it viewed this as not being anything to do with it, right? You were aware that Alberta was actively responding to it as a matter within its jurisdiction.
When I asked Minister Sani and I have a very good professional relationship where we are in regular contact when she was a Minister of Transportation. when I asked if she would be willing to issue a joint statement, because I felt having a joint statement by two levels of government, calling on the blockaders to go home, would send a strong message to those who are thinking of staying or those who are thinking of joining. She refused to do that because she said that this is a federal issue, because what the blockaders are objecting to, it has nothing to do with us. So I'm sharing this with you to explain to you where I received that sense that Alberta was saying that this is the federal government's problem.
Okay, well, if I could ask if the clerk could please pull up ssm.can 402302, which is a readout of your call with Minister Sawhney. I did not read her comments in the same way that you did, and so I'll pull those up for context. And so here's the readout of your meeting with Minister Sawhney. And if we could scroll down, please. Right there, sorry, the fourth point, we see Minister asks if we could do joint statement. And Minister Sawhney's response was maybe, however, this would seem as if she's endorsing the vaccine mandate. And that was her issue with issuing a joint statement. Not that she thought that the matter was federal jurisdiction to deal with. Is that fair summary of what the comment was?
This is a readout. And my memory is that, and it's not really that off from the readout. My memory is that she said that the protesters and the blockaders are opposed to the federal mandate. And that's why she was reluctant to appear like she's supporting the federal mandate. And she is reluctant to be appearing, to be involved with us on this.
Okay. And then you mentioned that it was your impression in your witness statement, you mentioned it was your impression from this conversation that existing tools in Alberta were not being used or were not sufficient. Were you aware that the RCMP were not able to carry out their enforcement action without having on hand the heavy towing equipment that we were just discussing Alberta was looking for?
I was aware that the blockade continued. Were you
aware that the enforcement action could not be taken out without the heavy towing equipment that Alberta was looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I was aware that there are different reasons, including towing capacity. So yes, and again, and overall, the outcome for me is that these blockades continued.
And with the knowledge that the enforcement action could not be taken out without the towing equipment, wouldn't you agree with me that there was a connection between existing authorities not yet being enforced as of the time of your conversation with Minister Sawhney on February 9th, and the fact that the RCMP hadn't yet secured the equipment that they needed? Those two ideas were very inextricably linked.
Again, the common response that I was getting as to when I kept asking why are the blockades at Coutts and other places continuing, there were different reasons. Some of them were safety, operational, including availability of tow trucks. And tow truck operators, by the way. It wasn't just tow truck operators.
And the readout that we're looking at right now from Minister Sawhney's call with you on February the 9th indicates that she iterated to you more than once that the RCMP were working on it, but that Alberta could not and would not insert itself to tell them exactly what to do. Do you recall that and see that before you?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. There are also documents on the record that show that your Deputy Minister, Michael Keenan, knew by the afternoon of February the 12th that Alberta had purchased towing equipment. To be clear in respect of a prior answer that you gave this afternoon, is it your evidence that no one had made you aware that by February 13th, Alberta had acted itself to purchase the equipment that the RCMP needed?
I was aware that Alberta is seeking to purchase tow trucks. I can't recall when I found out that those tow trucks were purchased, but I was aware that Alberta had made a decision to purchase tow trucks. And I was also informed that there was an issue with with operators for those tow trucks.
And you were aware by the 13th of February that they had made that purchase, correct?
I don't recall if I knew on the 13th or not. I can't recall that.
Do you recall whether it was before the Emergencies Act was invoked?
No, I can't recall that. I can't.
Okay. If you had known that, would your assessment of the necessity of the Emergencies Act have changed at all?
Look, the Emergencies Act was needed because we had a national issue. We had problems across the entire country, including a threat of other emerging troubled zones. So I think, and let me repeat, Coots as well had, during those 3 weeks or 2.5 weeks, was on and off. So there was also still no confidence that the whole issue is going to be resolved this quickly. So the short answer to your question, no, I don't think it would have changed my mind.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions this afternoon.
Thank you.
And thank you for your indulgence, Commissioner.
No problem. Okay, next is the City of Ottawa.
Daniel Chomsky for the City of Ottawa, and we have no questions for the Minister.
Okay, so the big winner, Government of Canada.
Well, I only had 10 minutes to start with, so it's still not that long. Good afternoon, or I guess good evening, Minister. My name's Donnery Nygaard. As you know, I'm one of the lawyers for the Government of Canada. I want to take you back in time a little bit to before the blockade, the protests arrived in Ottawa. What was the situation with truck drivers being able to cross the border in both directions at that point in time?
So first of all, let me maybe even set the broader context. Our supply chains have been going through a lot of disruptions because of COVID, mostly COVID measures, with lockdowns, with border restrictions, that had an impact on our economy and on our supply chains. So it was really critical for me personally and for our government to keep monitoring our supply chain and the health of our supply chain. And in fact, one of the rationale that we believed the vaccine mandate would be good for our supply chain is to protect the health and safety of the workers in the supply chains. With absenteeism being high because of COVID, with spread of COVID, with the risk of contracting COVID, the vaccine mandate, one of its rationale is that it ensured some additional resilience within our supply chain, including for our truck drivers. So when we, and there was coordination, you're asking about truck drivers across the borders, there was coordination between us and the US. They also required similar measures for truck drivers to cross the border. Prior to invoking or implementing that measure, I had many consultation with trucking associations, with industry, and it had come to me that about 90% of truck drivers were fully vaccinated, that this measure would not have a measurable impact. However, we'll continue to encourage the remaining who have not been vaccinated to get vaccinated. So all that long preamble to say is that I kept an eye on the volume of our truck activities across the border on a regular basis and published those on my social media to reassure the public that while the vaccine mandate is working, it has not had a measurable impact on the flow of our goods and our truck drivers across the border.
And you mentioned that you were coordinating with the US who had a similar mandate in place. So if Canada had lifted or back in place the exemption for truck drivers, would an unvaccinated truck driver be able to cross the Canada-US border?
Not a Canadian truck driver. A U.S. driver may be, but not a Canadian truck driver.
And you mentioned supply chains as well. I understand that on January 31st, you participated in a supply chain summit. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Sure. I just explained to you how vulnerable and turbulent our economy was at that moment as we are coming out of the acute phase of COVID after significant disruptions. Supply chains certainly were impacted, and what our government wanted to do and what I wanted to do is go to action on figuring out what can the federal government do to strengthen our supply chains, to respond to the ongoing challenges that we're facing. And we held a summit. I hosted a summit that invited key stakeholders, industry leaders from different sectors to come together and talk about what they're hearing, what they're seeing, and what their recommendations are for the federal government to ensure that we have stronger, more resilient supply chains. And by the way, it included representatives of the trucking industry.
And you also spoke about the feedback that you were getting from the trucking industry. And I just want to, and industries in general, I just want to pull up a document, Mr. Clerk, if you could pull up ssm.can.50958.
I have to say, I'm impressed at how fast you pull the documents.
And is this a document you recognize, Minister?
Yes, this is a press release by the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturing Association.
And
Manufacturers Association.
And was this something you were aware of at the time?
Yes. In fact, I think I met with them on that day. So I met with different industry associations and representatives, included the Vehicle Manufacturers Association, included the Auto Part Association, included the Retail Council, it included the manufacturers and exporters, and they to talk to them about the impact that the blockades is having on their industry, to hear from them, and I can go through some of what I heard, whether it was from the vehicle manufacturers, GM, Ford, Stellantis, Honda, Toyota. All of them had shift disruption, and some of them were considering shipping on planes engines, because some lines were being shut down and some production is being delayed. I also heard from 3M, a medical company, the Retail Council, and grocers. It was quite evident, again, not only just through data, but I mentioned earlier in their voice, how anxious they were about the well-being of their business, about the impact that this is going to have on investment in their business, about decisions that some of them had U.S. headquarters in the investment decisions that their headquarters was going to make. So there was a big concern, and they at the time issued the statement to again articulate that concern.
And can we also pull up ssm.can.50987, please? Do you recognize this letter?
Yes.
And is this something that it's not addressed to you, it's addressed to the Prime Minister and to all of the premiers, but were you provided with a copy of it?
Yes.
And if we can scroll down to the body of it, this was from the Canadian
Trucking Alliance.
Trucking Alliance, that's right.
And the Canadian manufacturers and exporters.
Yes, that's correct. And the sentiments expressed in this letter, are those reflective of the sorts of things that you were hearing from the various groups that you've just referred to?
Yes.
Okay. And then can we have ssm.can.988, please? And this is, as I understand it, or perhaps you can tell us who Ninu Forrest is? Do you know?
Yes, Ninu is a staff in my office.
Okay, so this appears to be a readout from a call you had on February 11th with the Teamsters. Am I reading that correctly?
Correct.
Okay. And we don't need to go through the document, but can you tell us about that call? You can look at the document to refresh your memory if you need.
Yes, this was with, I think, either the president or the executive director at the time of Teamsters, and expressing their concern about the blockades and how much flack they were getting from those who are supporting the blockaders because they had publicly spoken out against the illegal activities. And you know, they were again asking us to do something to end these issues.
And was this reflective of the kind of information that you were receiving from other stakeholders in the industry?
Yes, the Canadian Trucking Alliance said the same thing because again they issued. Again, a statement, I think, on January 31st, right at the beginning of the illegal occupation, that they've distanced themselves from those activities and that they do not represent truckers and the profession of truckers. But they then told us that they did receive a lot of threats by those, I guess, who are sympathetic to the blockaders.
And if we can pull up ssm.nsc.can 50780. This appears to be a summary of the stakeholder engagement by you and your staff on February 10th. Have you seen this before?
Yes.
So the first entry there is an engagement you had with MP, and I'm going to
Kuzmarchik.
Thank you. That you've already spoken about. And then the next one is your call with Secretary Buttigieg, which you've also already spoken about. If we could scroll down. Then there's an entry in regard to an engagement you had with global automakers, and you referred to this in passing, but could you tell us a little bit more about that call? And were these all on February 10th, or is this just a summary of the calls that had occurred until up to that date?
I can't recall, to be honest. If the sheet says it was done on the 10th, then it was done on the 10th. I know they were all done within few days, so within that week. But this, as I alluded earlier, this was a conversation with representatives of Toyota and Honda, and they were explaining to me about the severe impact that these blockaders are having on their business, the shortage of parts, the impact on assembly lines, the impact on workers, and the impact on confidence. And again, don't forget, we're at a time where there's a transformation in the auto sector, the building of new vehicles, electric vehicles, there's competition between different jurisdictions, who's going to get which plant. Obviously, the Toyota Canada and Honda Canada and others were competing with their fellow other regions around the world for investments. They felt that this put a lot of the plans that they have in place at risk.
And I'm not going to go through each of the entries on here, but if we can just scroll down further, you'll see there's a number of consultations there listed that were conducted apparently by your staff. But is it fair to say that your staff would have briefed you on all of these consultations?
Yes.
And if we can pull up pb.can.50734. And just while that's being pulled up, you had been taken earlier to the February 12th IRG minutes in which you discussed Manitoba, and I believe you said you'd had a consultation with your counterpart in Manitoba. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And this is a letter from the Premier of Manitoba dated February 11th. Were you aware of this letter?
I don't think I saw it. No, I don't think I've ever seen it before.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it at that then. You also continued to conduct consultations with some of your provincial counterparts after the invocation of the Emergencies Act, as I understand it. Can you tell us about that, please?
Correct. And these were part of the outreach that I'd been doing for a while. And I had a call with my BC counterpart, Minister Fleming, and I had a call with my Nova Scotia counterpart to talk about BC, by the way, at the time, even though when I spoken with them, and I think it was the day the Emergencies Act was invoked.
February 14th?
Correct. But at that time, if I recall correctly, the Surrey port of entry was still blocked. So we had a conversation about the fact that the Emergencies Act was invoked. He told me that his government supported it. And I asked him for the situation in Surrey. He said it's still blocked, but that now hopefully we'll find a resolution to it. So that was the extent of the conversation with Nova Scotia. There were also threats of blockades and protests around port, around the legislator. They had, I think, invoked their own state of emergency. So I just reached out as well as part of my effort to reach out to many of the provinces who were impacted to speak with her, to get a sense from her about what she and her government felt about the invocation of the Emergencies Act and about the current situation in the province. And she also indicated, I think, that they were supportive of the Emergencies Act.
Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Okay, well, you didn't take up all your delegated time. Okay, well, that was, thank you very much for coming and for testifying, and especially at this late hour. So you're free to go and enjoy the little bit of evening that's left.
Thank you, Your Honor.
So thank you. So we're going to adjourn until tomorrow morning at 9:30.
The commission is adjourned. La commission est adjournée.